So I wanted to jump on here today to talk a little bit about my updated feelings on intermittent fasting. I used to be a big proponent of intermittent fasting, and I still am. I've experimented with all of it for the most part. The 16-8, the OMAD type fasting, the every other day fasting, 5 to 2. So if you're familiar with fasting, I've experimented with most of it. And I really, when I was doing more fasting, I had settled in on that 16 to 18 hours of fasting almost daily. And then I would occasionally throw in a longer fast of 24 to 48 hours. So here's the thing, I'm still an advocate of fasting, but I have definitely modified my approach as I have entered perimenopause and as I've gotten a little bit older. And even some of my goals have changed as far as longevity and the way that I'm looking to live my life. So if you are in menopause, which is defined as not having had a period for at least a year, which is kind of arbitrary to be honest, but that's a topic for another day, you are generally safe to fast however you like. And I don't ever want to say that a woman who's in menopause is like a man, but your hormones at that point in time have all settled down to their lowest level and they're not fluctuating a lot. So you can fast more like a man once you are in menopause. So you could do the lean gains, which is the 16-8 fasting, OMAD every other day, 5 to 2. You could experiment with types of fasting that work well, or that might work well for you, because your hormones are at that point leveled out and they're no longer fluctuating, and you don't have to be as cautious about disrupting your hormone balance. But I do want you to keep listening. So if you are in full-on menopause, and you're past that transition through perimenopause, I want you to keep listening because fasting too much and too often can still be detrimental to your overall health. If you are under 35, you can often get away with more fasting. And I like to say that get away with because what I feel like is that women who are still cycling, especially if you are in the childbearing years, or you are trying to breastfeed, or you are looking to get pregnant, doing a lot of fasting can be detrimental. But when you're younger, as we all know, when we were in our 20s and early 30s, it seemed like we could get away with things. Like you can get away with eating some garbage in your 20s and you're probably not going to gain a bunch of weight. When you do that in your 40s, it's going to affect you differently. So I do tell women who are under 35, and this is when I was doing more of my fasting. I was doing a lot more intermittent fasting when I was in my mid 30s, and I could get away with it at that point. But again, if you are doing too much fasting because you are still cycling, and you should have fairly regular cycles at that point, you can still disrupt your hormones if you do too much. All right, so the main problem with most women and doing a lot of fasting, I call this the protein problem. So most women that I have met, that I have worked with personally, they are struggling to meet their protein targets even if they're not fasting. So if they're eating 3 or 4 meals per day, they're still struggling to get enough protein to build and maintain muscle. So even with that 12-hour feeding window, so if they wake up and they start eating at 7 and they have that 12-hour from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., that feeding window, most women are still struggling to meet their protein targets. So shortening the feeding window does not help them meet their protein targets. It can make it extremely challenging to do that. So this goes for all women. So those of you who are in menopause, it's extremely important for you. The older I get, the more I realize how important it is for you to maintain your muscle. If you are working out in the gym, if you're doing weightlifting, which you absolutely should be, so that you're building and maintaining your muscle mass, this is where not eating enough and not eating enough protein becomes really problematic. So even if you are in menopause, if you are fasting too much and you are not meeting your protein targets, this is going to affect your longevity because you're going to lose muscle mass. So really important pointer. So even if you are in menopause, you still need to make sure that you are meeting your protein targets. And it's really hard to do if you're doing like OMAD type fasting, or you're doing every other day kind of fasting. So whether you're young, middle-aged, or past menopause, the protein targets really matter. And if you find that, like through tracking, if you find that you aren't meeting your protein target and you're trying to fast, it might be time to back off on the fasting. So, and this is if your goal is to keep and build muscle, and it should be. We start to lose muscle mass at about a rate of 1% per year after the age of 35. And that, again, if you lose 8% of your muscle mass over the course of a decade, you are going to have a lower metabolic rate. You're going to feel weaker. You're going to be more prone to breaking bones, to getting hurt, slips and falls, and all of that stuff. So very important that you maintain what you have and even build. So you don't want to follow a diet or and again, intermittent fasting, not really a diet, it's just a format of eating. So, but you don't really want to follow any sort of a plan or a diet that would limit your protein intake if you're trying to maintain and build muscle. All right, fasting also, so this is kind of my next pointer. Fasting, as it turns out, is not a great solution for long-term fat loss unless you understand the importance of cycling your fasting routine and you are strength training. So initially people were like, oh my gosh, I love fasting. I lost so much weight fasting. It really, really works. But then we started to realize, and you see this with the keto people, you see this with the carnivore people, you see this with the, the other people who are doing the sort of restrictive diets. Now all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, you can't do that all the time. You need to be cycling through these diets, eating normally sometimes, and then going back to the diet. The same thing goes with fasting. It's not a great solution for long-term fat loss unless you know how to use it. So fasting can help you lose weight because, as I said before, it's really hard to eat enough protein and calories in a shortened feeding window. So the tighter you squeeze your feeding window, the fewer calories you're really going to be able to fit in because you're just not going to be hungry with that huge meal that you're eating. So, and here's an experiment you can try. Try eating lunch and dinner within a 4-hour window. So try eating lunch at 3 p.m. and then eat dinner at 6 p.m. You might be really hungry for lunch at 3, but you are not going to be hungry at 6 p.m. for dinner. So it's very hard to get enough calories. So fasting does naturally help you lower your caloric intake, but again, in some cases you're really not going to get enough. And it's going to be a struggle for you to meet your protein targets. So again, it does lower caloric intake. So initially you will see some weight loss from fasting. But if you do it for too long, and this is where people really made their mistake, it's easy to fall in love with fasting because you have great energy, you have great mental clarity. There are some great benefits to doing a longer daily fast. However, anything that you do for too long, your body adjusts to. Our bodies are built to adjust. Your body is not going to let you starve to death if you're not eating enough calories. So what it's going to do is it's going to lower your thermostat. So if you're only eating 1,200 calories a day and you do that consistently, your body is simply going to start burning only 1,200 calories per day. So your body's going to lower your metabolic rate to match your intake if you are using fasting and you are doing it too long, you're not cycling it. So if you're doing fasting for fat loss, you need to do two things. You need to strength train and you need to cycle through periods of normal eating and periods of fasting. All right, fasting can cause muscle loss. I mentioned that a little bit earlier, especially if you are not strength training. Fasting naturally lowers your caloric intake. It lowers your protein intake. It can be very, very difficult for you to maintain muscle mass if you are not strength training and getting enough protein. So fasting can cause muscle loss, and this will cause weakness, lethargy, bone loss, and depressed metabolic rate. We don't want any of those things. All right. A lot of the studies you have probably heard, so this is proponents of fasting, will tell you, well, fasting is good for longevity, which means living longer. And research does consistently show that low-calorie diets do seem to prolong lifespan. There's not as much studies in humans, but definitely mouse and rat studies show that there is a prolonged lifespan effect from low-calorie dieting, and fasting promotes lower-calorie eating. So the question, though, becomes not necessarily the living longer. So fasting definitely can make you live longer. There's an autophagy effect, so that's a cellular turnover effect. So those are good things. But the question becomes a quality of life question. So if you lose muscle and you feel weak and you open yourself up to potential bone loss, which would lead to bone fractures, you feel tired all of the time, is it really worth living a longer life? Like, is the quality of life going to be there? And I think that that is an important question for people to think about when it comes to fasting. The older I get, the more I realize how closely muscle is tied to longevity, and not just longevity, okay? Not just living longer. Who wants to live longer if you're sick or you feel like shit? So it's tied to longevity and quality of life. So you do not want to do things that cause you to lose muscle. Anything that causes muscle loss is a no-go in my current book of health. So I have definitely reduced my fasting for those reasons. Fasting, this is the next thing that's kind of a con against fasting. Fasting sometimes promotes disordered eating. Can fasting allow you to eat garbage and be healthier? Studies actually show that yes. To an extent. So some studies have shown that people who are on 1 meal a day eating, so that's OMAD, they only eat 1 meal a day, they can eat copious amounts of junk food during that 1 meal, and their blood markers will actually improve if they came from eating like the normal standard, 3 or 4 or 5 meals per day. Their health will improve despite the fact that they are eating a lot of junk during their feeding window. However, long term, I think it makes sense that not only does this encourage binge behavior, you are still going to run into nutrient and protein deficiencies because the food you're eating doesn't contain any real nutritive value except for calories. So I do believe that sometimes fasting promotes that eating pattern of like, well, I'm going to eat whatever I want, or I'm going to overeat because I didn't eat all day long. And that cycle can perpetuate over and over and over. All right, so what do I recommend for women over 40 when it comes to fasting? So I absolutely believe that our digestive systems need a daily rest of about 12 to 14 hours. So this is very moderate and is generally considered safe for everyone, even pregnant and lactating women. Most women can meet their nutrient and protein targets with a 10 to 12 hour feeding window and still get the benefits of a moderate daily fast. So all this really means is that you would start eating at like 7 a.m. and make sure you stop eating by about 7 p.m. That's going to be a 12-hour fast overnight, and then a 12-hour feeding window. And if you want to extend that a little bit further, it is generally going to be safe for most women to do that 14 hours. So that would be like 7 p.m. you stop eating, and then you don't eat again the next day until 8 or 9 a.m. Okay. So easy peasy, it's very simple, very doable, very safe. If you are in menopause, it is probably safe for you to fast longer and more often, but be very clear on your goals. If you want to build muscle, you are going to need to make sure that you are eating enough calories and protein. If fat loss is your primary goal, you can cycle through phases where you're doing more intense fasting, but you still need to make sure that you are eating enough protein and strength training so that you don't lose that important muscle mass. For women in perimenopause, women who are trying to conceive or breastfeed, women with known hormonal dysregulation, women under a lot of life stress, women with previous disordered eating patterns, or women who are in heavy athletic training. Long fasts are probably not appropriate. 16-8 fasting, it's probably not going to be a good idea for you. So you need to focus on getting good nutrition, staying on a meal schedule, and fueling your body well. A 12 to 14 hour fast will still be perfectly fine for you, but I don't think that it will be beneficial for you to go beyond 14 hours of fasting if you fall into any one of those categories. So I hope that you found this helpful. This is kind of my updated view as I've grown into my perimenopause years. This is my updated view on intermittent fasting, and this is how I use it, and this is how I'm coaching my clients currently when it comes to intermittent fasting. So I hope you found this helpful. If you do have questions, comments, you can post them in the comments below, or you can email me at kellybailey1980@gmail.com. Have a great day.